So hey guys, it's Smowtown here, and today I wanted to talk about the Trickster killer who I've been able to play quite a lot in the PTB, and talk about how you can use him and how I perceive him being used when he gets released into the full game. So the Trickster is a pretty cool killer with a cool backstory and a pretty unique look, and yet his power at first glance to a lot of us appears to have been, a lesser, weaker version of a combination between the Huntress's power and the Plague's power. I've played a good 10 or so games as the Trickster, and more against him as a survivor, given the queues. When surviving against him, there are times that I do notice that the killer could have actually just got a down or a hit if they just used an M1 instead of trying to use the laceration technique to try and get an injury. So, however, there are players that I've seen to be very effective using his power, easily dispatching the whole team of survivors. And following these observations and my own experience with the Trickster, I wanted to share and give my 2 cents on how I think he should be played, how his power should be used, and to do this I'll look at some of his add-ons, his perks, and when to use his power at certain points. So please note before I start this, I'm a distinctly average killer. I sit around the rank 4, so I'm by no means a top tier killer, but I do play a lot of killers, so I just thought I'd be able to give my insights as to someone who's played quite a bit of him on the PTB. So let's start by having a broad look at the power of the killer, which is the Showstopper ability, which is essentially him throwing knives. It operates similar to how the Huntress's power work, in that you hold the power button to load up the knives or get ready to throw, and then you tap it just to throw a single one, but the way that it works is really meant to be thrown a lot at a time. So you hold down the attack button after you've prepared it, and you kind of throw a stream of them, and you start with 60 of them. Over time, as you hit the survivor, you'll see a dial around the survivor build up, and once that builds up to full laceration, that is a hit. Essentially, it counts as a hit, so it'll either down them or put them into the entrance state if they were healthy. The first thing to note is that despite what you'd probably expect going into play this killer, they are not long range at all. The Huntress's hatchets can be extremely long range if you're accurate with them, whereas this is kind of more similar to a shotgun, I'd say, in that the spread starts out really tight, and then as it further goes out, it spreads further and further. So even if you're aiming right at the person, you'll still be missing like 1 in every 3 or something like that. So it's when you're right behind them that it's most useful, because then every single consecutive one that you're throwing, if you're throwing a stream, will hit them right in the back and build up that laceration meter quite quickly. So first of all, temper your expectations of long range sniping with it. Is more for using in a chase when you're close up behind someone. The second thing to note is that if you do get a hit, which is when you get the laceration meter full, the survivor will get a boost, much like they would if you hit them with an M1 attack, so they'll get that sprint boost. So it's not like you'll be able to get an easy hit on them and then follow up with a quick hit like you would maybe a hatchet with Huntress, where you could get a close hatchet and then hit them with the axe. So I found it more useful to use the power to get the second hit, and this is just my experience, because that first boost kind of negates any kind of advantage you get. Of course, there are certain situations where you wouldn't be able to get an M1 hit and you might be able to get a throwing knife hit, but we'll cover that in a second. So in general, when in a chase, I've found that it's better to conserve my ammo, because you have 60, so you'll have to stock up. You'll go through those 60 very fast, given that you're throwing them in a kind of constant stream, and you'll have to kind of keep reloading at lockers, much like the Huntress does. And I find it better to conserve that ammunition for the second part once you've got an M1 hit already, and then you follow up with the laceration hits. So we're going to look at kind of a couple of examples I've pulled together where I've found these attacks to be the power to be useful. So for example here, I first of all M1 the survivor, as I've been saying, getting the first hit, and then I'm going to use the laceration hits to get the secondary hit. So the survivor tries to loop me after I've hit them around a short, by short I mean low down loop where I can see over, and the thing about the knives is they have a far smaller hitbox than the Huntress's hatchets. So when you throw a hatchet over some of these covers, it'll just hit even if it's above it. Whereas the knives have the ability to slip through little cracks and little gaps in the pallet. So you can see here that when I get the survivor round to a certain point, I know that there's a gap that I can fit my knives through, and I consistently hit her through that gap. So I keep nailing her every time we go in that loop. She's not going to use the pallet because she knows that if she jumps over the pallet, I'm going to be able to get a few hits on her. So eventually, when she's close to full laceration, she breaks away, and it gives me essentially a clean shot to get that last laceration hit on her, and I get a down. So that's the kind of most useful basic example of how I found it. I get them M1. Usually when you hit a survivor and you get them with an M1, they'll try to go to a loop, a jungle gym, or the killer shack. Something like that, and in this case then you can get your second down usually with your knives, especially if it's one of those low ones like the example I showed you there, where you can just throw over the top and throw through gaps. Just pick your shots, and once you've got that laceration built up, they'll probably try and break from the loop, and then you'll be able to get down. I've also found the power to be quite useful for zoning in certain situations. Much like the Huntress's hatchets, you can dissuade survivors from moving certain ways just by loading up your throw. Not even throwing sometimes, because if they go over a ledge or a windowsill, then you've got a couple of easy hits there with the knives as they go through that animation where they're essentially static, and the survivors will know this, being familiar with the Huntress. So it makes a good deterrent to make them not want to go through ledges when they're looping you, and if they do go through it, then it's a win-win because you get those laceration hits anyway. So I'm going to show you an example of this kind of zoning thing with combination of one of the perks, which again I'll show you. So this aspect of the killer actually works really well with the favourite perk of the Tricksters of mine, which is the Hex Crowd Control. Hex Crowd Control blocks a window for X amount of time after a survivor fast faults through it, which they are often going to do in a chase when they're trying to get away from you. Personally, as a killer, the bit that I probably most suck at, and is the reason I'm not a top tier killer, is the loops with double windows or the killer shack loop where they can just go through the window. So I personally prefer killers where I can essentially negate that by blocking that off by either using the trapper to put a trap down, or using blight to hit off the door and then deflect towards the survivor before they hit the window. Things like that, because I'm not very good at mind gaming around the killer shack. And again here, the Hex Crowd Control comes in extremely useful. So it blocks a window after they fast fault through it. So if you're doing the loop around the killer shack, they can only use that window once, and then you've got them going through a straight path, and you will get them. So the example I want to show is that I force a survivor out of a loop here because I use the Hex Crowd Control activates as she jumps through a window, forcing her away from that loop and saving me lots of time. So as you can see here, I'm zoning her by throwing knives, and I'm making her want to break line of sight with me, so she goes through the window and bang, she blocks it with the Hex Crowd Control, and then she's forced to run away from the loop instead of us just doing this dance around this jungle gym for about a minute, which cost me precious time. So that's a really useful aspect of the power combined with the Hex Crowd Control, is that you can control where they're going by loading up your knives to throw just by threatening it, or by also using the Hex Crowd Control to stop them from going through windows endlessly. So for me, the power is useful for the following reasons: second hitting in a chase, zoning, and hitting survivors over the top of short loops. We'll return to his other perks in a moment, but let's look at some of his add-ons and killer abilities, because there are some real good ones. So the Edge of Revival add-on allows blades to shatter when they hit the environment, causing 50% splash damage to the survivor. Again, making it hit round loops and pallets even easier. If they're jumping over a pallet and you're smashing your knives into the pallet, it's going to get some splash damage on them. The Cut Through You single add-on allows the blades to pierce through survivors and do 50% laceration damage to those behind them, so it can subsequently go through the first survivor you hit and cause damage to one's behind. Very situational, it's not always going to come in useful. You probably go through a match and not have it benefit you at all, but there have been basement plays when three teammates are coming up from a rescue, and I'd love to have just been able to riddle them full of knives, and the add-on would probably be good for that type of play. Another great add-on is a brown common one, is the one called the Trick Pouch, which simply allows more blades to be taken, and that's obviously always a good thing. There are a number of add-ons that increases speed while throwing the knives, which is quite important, especially if you're using it, like I suggest, when the survivor is looping or trying to get away from you in a chase. And these are the Caged Heart Shoes and the Killing Part Cords. Finally, my personal favourite, because it alters the nature of the power much like the Cut Through You single does, is the Trick Blades. And this allows the blades to ricochet off the environment and deal an extra 100% laceration damage when they do so. Not only is this like a lot of fun seeing your knives bounce around corners and whatnot, I imagine that with some practice you could become extremely deadly with these, getting these around some square loops. So the add-ons are great, and they definitely add to that second hit anti-loop vibe that I'm getting from him so far. So let's take another look at his perks quickly before I wrap this video up. Aside from Hex Crowd Control, which is again an anti-loop ability, he also has a No Way Out, which is another way in which you can control a map. So the No Way Out perk adds time before the survivors are able to access the switches to the gates at the end of the game. It can add, at the highest level of the perk, it can add up to 10 seconds per survivor that you've hooked before the switch is allowed to be touched. So this could be a total of 40 seconds if you've hooked each of the survivors at one point. At 40 seconds at that point in the game, pretty huge, especially if you combine it with, say, Noed. They're in a bit of danger at that point, so pretty useful. And if there's 2 to 1 survivors left, it's pretty much game over. It's definitely going to make a huge difference. Finally, his other one that I haven't mentioned is Starstruck, and this activates when he's carrying a survivor. Again, very situational. It activates on a survivor who's in his terror radius as you're carrying another survivor, and it gives them the exposed status. So again, it's situational, but it will deter hook blocking and hook diving. And if they do go for it, then you've got a free slug right there. So it's pretty good, and I always find that survivors will try and block that hook as they should do, and this is definitely a big deterrent for that. So if you really don't like that type of play, this is a good antidote for that. So overall, he's a little finicky to use to get the knife throwing right. Initially I tried to use him as a long range killer, but then realised that it's more like a shotgun and you have to use it really close range. And then second of all, after I understood that there's that boost as if it's a normal hit, once you get them into the first laceration state, it's probably better to use it as a second hit. It's also great around loops because you're able to throw above the loop as the survivor runs around, a lot easier than a hatchet, and it only takes 8 or so knives to actually cause that state, so you can easily finish off the chase there. But again, that's just my initial impressions as an average killer after a day with the killer, and there might be a far better player who really cracks the way to play it, but that's just my thoughts. There's a lot of potential here, quite difficult to use, not as weak as I had initially thought though, and that's what I wanted to get across in this video. Anyway, I hope you like this video, guys. If you want to join me for more Dead by Daylight content, I almost forgot what I was going to say there, please give me a like and subscribe, as I'm going to be covering it in a lot more detail. I've done a video on the lore for the Trickster, so please check that out, and please leave a comment and tell me your thoughts on how you've played the Trickster. But until next time, guys, take care.